But if you've done a really fast variation one, maybe you want to have
a little slower, a little more, yeah. Thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
How are you? How's everything going?
Yeah, good. Very good.
Can I get your first thoughts sitting down at this piano? What you notice, what you feel?
Well, it's such a beautiful old instrument, a Steinway D with beautiful ivory keys. So just the touch, even without playing a note, feels quite, I don't know, personal. And of course, there's the added significance of, who used to practice on this piano, Glenn Gould. And I just kept thinking, I hope no one ever washed those ivory keys. Sometimes, you shake hands with John Lennon or Paul McCartney or whatever rock star or, celebrity in history and people don't want to wash their hands. I hope no one watched those ivory keys.
No, I don't, even through COVID, I don't think they ever got disinfected.
Oh, yeah.
What is it about Gould? Let's start there. I mentioned that it's not just his playing, but his approach to music. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think it's simply, the most creative, versatile pianist of all time. Redefined the role of, the classical artist as a recording artist. In a way, I think opened up so many new dimensions in the studio and made us all, post-Gould, have a completely different perception of what the studio can be and what it is. I think before Gould, the great majority of performers were very much, dreading going into the studio, hated the idea of having to capture themselves and then, listen to the results, in close-up microphones. And I think, they saw the idea of playing live concerts as the real deal and the studio as something sort of obnoxious, a little bit like something you had to do, a little bit like paying taxes or something like that. I think Gould very much opened the idea of the studio and the microphones, and that whole setting as an art form on its own. And I do think that the early Goldberg Variations from 1955, his debut on Columbia, I do think that is actually a record that changed the course of music history, because it is, in my opinion, the first real work of art from a studio perspective. We know how that he played the aria in that recording. I think he recorded it some 21 times, not because of any mistakes he made, but because of a different approach and a different way of thinking about what the studio can be and how you can sort of aim for your ideal in a different way than people had done before, I think.
For those who are listening who haven't spent much time in recording studios or haven't spent that much time with Gould, can you break that down for me a little bit more? Because I think that most people would think that when a piano player would go into a studio, the mics would be set up, the lights would be just so, they would sit down and they would play the Goldberg Variations top to tail, and there you go. You have it. And then you might do it a couple of times, but there you have it. It's a facsimile or it's a recreation of a live performance. When you say he used the studio, he maneuvered the studio, what do you mean by that?
Well, he had a love affair with the microphone and with all the things that make up a studio, with all the cables. He knew that if you place, a microphone, you move it back and forth, let's say just 1 inch, a couple of centimeters, it completely changes the sound of the recording. And it's sort of the art of the fragile. And what you've described, what people might think that you just come into the studio straight from Carnegie Hall and you just sort of play that concert and then capture it on the microphones and that's the recording. That's great, but that's a little bit like the difference between stage acting and making a film. What you're doing when you're making a record, you're essentially making a film. When you make a film, you do a lot of retakes, you do a lot of extreme fine-tuning, and I think he was the first one to really do that in the studio. And in a sense, to be also not just a performer, but almost play the piano as if he was a producer. He's basically producing himself as he goes along, and he was involved in all the post-production, to an extreme degree. All those things, that is just a completely sort of new, disruptive, beautiful way of thinking about classical music and what you can do in the recorded format.
So last Gould question, I promise we'll talk about you.
I love to talk about Gould much more than talking about myself.
I understand. So what is it about those 55 Goldberg? So the Goldberg, for people who don't know, the Goldberg Variations, a piece composed by Johann Sebastian Bach, famously so a count could deal with his insomnia. Outside of the piece itself, what was it? Why do we talk? I mean, I think Canadians would love to hear this too, because Gould, we know. I mean, there's a statue of him. I don't know if did you see the statue of him outside?
Yeah. I mean,
with his arm around. Did you see the statue outside the CBC there?
Well, is that the one where he's sitting on a bench and you can sort of join him?
Yeah, you should go.
Last time I was here, I joined him for a conversation. Certainly, I know that's a great statue.
I think Canadians would love to, and I think we hear that the Goldberg Variations are. I mean, they're written about, they're talked about. What is it about that recording, in your perspective as a piano player, that makes them so? You called them groundbreaking. You called them visionary earlier.
It's eternally modern, just like Bach is. And somehow that recording is so pure and pristine, and it seems to mirror each and every generation and each and everyone who listens to it. And I think for us who play, piano and play Bach in post-Gould era, I mean, you at some point have to face it. And you can young pianists love to hate it, and older pianists, everybody has an opinion, but it's like great art. It doesn't necessarily unite people. It can divide people. And I think Gould very much embraced that. But there's something about the way he approached it and the way he also just approached from the musical perspective. What you have in Bach is kind of this clear, what we call polyphony, when you have, like 3 or 4 or 5 sort of musical lines that have very sort of individual existences and then sort of coexist like a beautiful family or something like that. I think he had a way of giving each and every of those lines in that counterpoint a unique life. So he seemed to be able, when he was playing Bach, to sort of compartmentalize his incredible brain so that he really had a different channel for different voices in the texture. So I love that, and I think that it was entirely, in a way, new the way he did it, and it's still new today, just like Bach's music. It's interesting, when you play Bach, you feel sometimes he's more modern than the very latest music to be written by today's composers.
I mean, I want to talk about that a little later on, but I think for people who don't know the piece, it was originally written for harpsichord, right?
Yeah. I mean, the beginning of the piece is here. You might know it. And on it goes. That's the aria. That's the beginning of the Goldberg Variations.
So I bring up the harpsichord because for people who don't know, the harpsichord is an instrument that doesn't have any dynamics. It would have been. Could you play the aria like it would be played on a harpsichord, as in with zero dynamic?
It's very hard. It's very hard.
Can you give it a shot? Can you give it a shot?
Well, you could. I mean, yeah. Well, the harpsichord sometimes has
I'm building towards something, I promise.
Sometimes the harpsichord has 2 manuals, and then there are dynamics between those 2 manuals. Okay. But within each manual, within each keyboard, there are no real dynamics, yeah. But you can try,
I can see you wincing.
It's really hard for me to do that, because on the piano, you would always round off the phrase. Just all these little micro dynamics. Actually, Gould, I think he had conflicting ideas about that. Sometimes I think he wanted to play more like the harpsichord on the piano, and sometimes less so.
Right.
And it's always something you can tune yourself, and you can do it differently every day, I'm an eternal romanticist myself at heart. I'm an incurable romantic. So I tend to love those microdynamics that the modern grand piano affords, which is why it's really hard for me to play it a little bit more in a squarer dynamic. But harpsichord has something else, So it's not to say that the piano is better than the harpsichord. It's just completely different beasts,
Thank you for warding off the letters I'm going to get from the harpsichord.
I know, but we have honestly.
I know.
Honestly speaking,
I'm only kind of joking.
Yeah.
Would you be able to do an impression of Gould playing the aria? Can you play the aria the way Gould did?
Oh my God!
Because I want you to play it like you.
But he played it so differently.
Okay.
There's the kind of extreme, what do you call it, sobriety or something of there's very kind of philosophical nature of the 1981 recording, the second one, the later one he did. No, I'm not actually going to pretend to be Gould because I'm just going to invite some ridiculous comments on me. But I'm not going to do that. But I'll talk about it. I mean, then there's a 55 where he's sort of a young man and he takes every variation, and it just sounds like sort of different planets, but belonging to the same solar system, But they're all so beautifully unique and in a way spontaneous and not really connected together with any sort of tempo meters or metrical, elements. But then there is a live recording that people don't really know, which tends to be kind of something I go to quite often for inspiration, because Gould, as a live performer, he stopped playing concerts when he was about, I think, 30 in 1962, if I'm not mistaken, or was it 64? I can't remember. One of those, very, very early. Anyway, so before he stopped playing concerts, he had some of the most incredible moments of 20th century piano in concert, and one of those was in Salzburg in the festival, and he played a big program with Mozart and all sorts of things on the first half, and then there was a Goldberg Variations on the second half, and those Goldberg Variations, they are so improvisatory, so spontaneous, so incredibly humane, and they're just very different from both studio recordings, but that is how it is. These variations, they do become your companion, and they become your mirror, and we change from day to day, concert to concert, certainly.
Well, can you explain that to folks? So for the reason I was hoping to get some of that, but I'm glad you played your aria earlier, is I think people would benefit from being able to hear how you bring your own personal approach to this music when you're interpreting it.
It's so interesting. You can do so many things with it. Well, you do variations on the variations through your tempo decisions, through your dynamics, through anything. So let's say you're feeling particularly happy, you can just open the aria, It's quite a brisk, happy walk. You can do that. You can do something like. So that's a completely different world.
A little more
obviously.
melancholy, a little more
much slower, completely different phrasing, different everything. You can for fun. Let's see what's happening in the left hand. You can take the low bass. Just that line. You can draw that out. You can do, less pedal, more pedal. You can do. Sorry. So. I mean, those are three. Just all like every measure, every moment in Bach seems to have almost infinite possibilities how to shape it.
Say tonight you're playing it in Toronto.
Yeah.
And 3 days later you're playing it in Vienna.
Yeah.
Tonight you're happy. In Vienna, you're jet lagged and exhausted.
Yeah.
Will your interpretation of the variations be different, or do you sort of have your way of playing it worked out?
Oh, it's very different. I mean, actually, like sometimes you play better when you're feeling horrible, and you play worse when you're feeling great.
But will the dynamics you play, will the music you play be different?
Let's say you play a note here, a note that you press the hammer, it hits the string, the sound goes. Where does the sound go? It goes from the piano to the basically back wall of wherever you find yourself, and it comes back to you. And that's the feedback you get, and that's the acoustic, and that's basically the dialogue that you have with the hall. So you play, let's say you play Carnegie Hall, and you just press that one G, and it goes there, hits this gorgeous hall, comes back, and you already have this incredible glow in the sound. Let's say you go to Vienna, like you say, and 3 days later you play that space, and you play that same note. The dimensions of the hall are so completely different, so that you're basically playing a different instrument.
Will that change the way you play the piece?
Oh, absolutely.
It
changes your timings, it changes your tempos, it changes everything. But you're also playing on different pianos. And don't forget, like a piano like this Gould's piano here, and it has 12,000 parts in it, and it's all handmade. And those parts are extremely vulnerable to any fluctuation in humidity and in temperature and in anything. So just think about it. Piano is a machine of 12,000 parts, and you take the temperature of the hall or outside, even 1 degree up, and it's a different beast. Man. So anyway, you are really having, very different experiences every time you play the piano, and every time you play a hall. I played those Goldberg Variations now 96 times, I think, throughout the whole world last year. I played them almost everywhere.
And?
That was so interesting to compare that dialogue you have with the acoustic of a hall. Let's say Sydney Opera House versus Carnegie Hall versus Vienna Musikverein or something like that versus Buenos Aires, or wherever you go, Los Angeles Disney Hall, or you name the hall. It's just such a different experience, and it's a different thing every time.
You've said that you got to know yourself through the process of playing it, this many times around the world. What do you mean by that? Got to know yourself?
Because you accept the changes from concert to concert. You accept that we're ever evolving and that you're not the same person you were yesterday, today. And my point with this whole global tour of the Goldberg Variations was to see if I could actually still be fascinated by them and still be discovering them at the end of the tour. Because I don't think you really ever know the Goldberg Variations, even if you play the Goldberg Variations 96 times and it looks like you know them, but you don't really know them. You always... Well, and if you think you know them, you probably should stop playing them. You know what I mean? I mean, you are discovering everything. This is, in a way, in my opinion, history's greatest keyboard work. And what he does is he creates so much infinite variety, actually, from such limited means, from such limited building blocks, really, from the aria. And like I said, every concert you do, you have so many options. You could take Variation 1, and Gould does it very interesting. In the first recording from 1955, he plays it so fast, it's shocking, that count tempo. And then in the 1981, he's more this is the same material, but you're basically in 30% slower tempo or something like that.
Yeah.
And I did quite a bit of that throughout the whole world. I was really having fun with doing interpretive variations on those variations. But if you take, let's say you go to a concert and you do play a slow first variation, then that does inform the next variation, because you're always in a way on the micro and the macro level. You're always thinking about the moment and all the things you're making happen in that second. But then, what you have just done will then influence what you do next. So any decision you make early on in the process will then govern perhaps the tempo that you choose for Variation 2. So if you do a slow Variation 1, maybe you want to do... Maybe you want to do a fast Variation 2. But if you've done a really fast Variation 1, maybe you want to have a
little slower, a little more, yeah.
Whatever. I mean, I'm just doing really rough sketches here, but you get the idea.
What I'm struck by is the deep thought and consideration, and I love what you said about the micro and macro of approaching the music. So when did you start thinking about music in general that way? I mean, the story I heard is that music was in your life from a very, very young age. We're switching to the you part of the conversation now, and that your family got, and I love the story if I get it right. Your family inherited some money, and they could have bought a new car or they could have bought a new house, but in your very small apartment, they bought a grand piano, a Steinway Grand. Is that right?
I mean, the story is even better, actually.
Tell me.
So basically, my parents, they don't come from families of means, really, and they were young students in Berlin in 1980, actually, when my father's father passed away, and it was a terribly tragic thing, and it happened quite suddenly. So they inherited a little bit of money, in the aftermath. They didn't own anything. They didn't have an apartment. They were just, very poor students living on, maybe $1,000 a month or something like that. And what did they do with the money? They actually decided to take a loan and add to the inheritance and use all the money on buying a glorious new Steinway grand piano fresh from the factory. And they did this before they, owned even their first apartment or owned anything, actually. So there they are. I was born in 1984, and they moved to Iceland, in that year. And we, they managed to buy their first apartment then, and it was a tiny little basement flat, really quite a few, just very few square meters. I had to share a room with my two sisters. The living room was so small that it was basically only the Steinway piano. So we basically had that for 6 or 7 years. But, the piano was the apartment, and they made that thing about, prioritizing in the right way, which I think affected and influenced so much the way my life would then, in which direction my life would go.
And what was being played on the home piano growing up?
Oh God, I mean, I remember like my early experiences were like mom practicing, sorry. Piece I should never played, the Chopin. Chopin Fantasy in F minor. She was and is very much a romantic. Meanwhile, my father is actually a composer, like a modern composer. So he writes very atonal stuff and something that's not really in major or minor. And
Would he be playing it on the piano?
Well, he would play. Those kinds of sounds, something so different from the kind of beautiful melodies of Chopin or Beethoven or Mozart or whatever. So I always had those two things. My dad would be composing in his much more abstract language. And my mother would be, playing a bit of Chopin and teaching, all day long. I would just sit in and listen to those lessons and be a little bit jealous that the piano wasn't mine and these, students were coming in and stealing my piano time. At the end of the day, when the last student would leave, I would invariably go to the piano and try to play some of the things that I had heard,
What was the scene in Iceland for this type of music, for classical music at the time? And I want to talk about that term classical music a little bit later, but I sort of know Iceland through, of course, avant-garde music and through rock music and through, Sigur Rós or Björk or, or rock or garage rock. When you were coming up, when you had sort of started to establish yourself, when you were before you moved to New York, what was the scene like in Iceland at the time?
The only thing that's like less clear than the future is the past. It's really hard. Like when I think about it, Iceland was such a sort of closed off place in the 90s, and I'm born in 1984, and I was sometimes thinking about how lucky I am to remember the time, sort of be the last generation that sort of remembers time before the internet and before YouTube and before all of it.
Yeah.
Before the floodgates opened. I think Iceland was an intensely musical place. It's always been, so sparsely populated on that big island with all that darkness and, the cold winters. People were singing in choirs, and they always have, and people were playing, and the level of music was quite high, but we would have very limited access to great international concerts. That's for one thing, Today, if you're a 10-year-old living in Iceland, first of all, you have much more variety and greater concerts than we probably had. But second of all, you just jump on a plane with your parents and you just go to London. It's like a 2-hour plane ride. And then you just go and see whatever you want to see in London, or you fly to New York, or you just go see. We just didn't do that in the 90s. So I think about my upbringing and sort of being there, we had more freedom because the world wasn't being pushed sort of into your face like it is currently. If you're a 10-year-old or a 7-year-old talented piano kid, you're bound to go on YouTube these days, and you're bound to see all the 7-year-olds who are playing all the Chopin etudes and all the difficult piano pieces in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tokyo, in London, and you have this. And
then what would happen to you if you're a young piano kid and you saw that?
I think these days it's dangerous because there's this kind of like you're always maybe a little bit too aware of what everybody else is doing around you, and I think what you have to do in music is to listen to your own voice and figure out what you want to do. And that should be encouraged in music students as early as possible. But of course, there are also great advantages to YouTube and to be able to see all those kids in Beijing and Moscow and anywhere else. But I just think in my case, I just had this kind of freedom with my music. And, my parents would rather ask me not to practice than to practice because I was practicing, they would be like, you just go out, play football, be with your friends, be normal, just have a normal childhood. And in a sense, I was very talented, but they didn't push me into playing the piano 6 hours a day early on. So in a way, playing the piano was always something I did out of pleasure. It was something I did out of sort of passion and inspiration because I loved the piano. It was just a playground for me, the piano. So I think it's a dangerous path, to push children too hard in that respect. It's better to build, from a more natural source when it comes to why you practice and why you play the piano.
One of the things that I find interesting about you is sort of how you follow the path of a conventionally successful classical musician, but then it sort of pivots. So you do lessons, you go to music school, you go to Juilliard in New York. Then the financial crash of 2008 happens. Times were really hard in Iceland. The economy there crumbled. I need you to connect the dots for me on this. So my understanding was the 2008 financial crash changed the way you approached at least your life in music or your career in music or your approach to the piano world. Can you put that together for me?
It was interesting. Yeah, so I was 24 at the time. I had 6 years in New York City, Juilliard, studying. And I chose New York because it's the greatest contrast to Iceland. I would have Carnegie Hall and I would have the New York Philharmonic, the Metropolitan Opera, you name it. I would just go out 2 or 3 nights a week to a show and to a concert. And then I moved to Europe and I wanted to sort of start on my own. And then everything collapsed around me. It was so bleak, the outlook for my country. So I really, had to reevaluate everything from that experience. First of all, we lost the little money we had. I had to apply to the Central Bank of Iceland to be able to pay my £700 rent in Oxford. We had to decide who we were and what we were and what the country stood for and what people decided. And I actually pushed quite hard, even if I was just a kid. I lobbied and I played sort of secret private concerts. We lobbied for the finishing of Harpa Concert Hall, which is this glorious, beautiful concert house in Reykjavik, which was half finished and half not finished. And that was being paid for by one of the banks that was then collapsed. And the state was so bankrupt that it's just hard to understand. And then there was this idea was, what do we do with this half-finished structure? Do we just tear it down, or do we indeed change it into a prison for the, for the bankers who've committed these crimes? That was actually a discussion that took place. It took place in Parliament. It was very interesting. There were all these things. Or should it be a monument to the failure of Iceland?
Right.
Should we just have this half-finished thing? So you just go downtown and you just see this thing and you're just like, oh, yeah, we suck. We're a terrible failed nation, right?
Everybody gather around.
Thankfully, they decided with the right politicians, they decided to actually finish the building, even if we really couldn't afford it. And in retrospect, it was the greatest decision. And it was really part of the renaissance of Iceland and rebranding the country and rethinking our values. So I don't know on the personal level if the banking crisis changed me so much. I mean,
the story that I heard is that you had taken almost more of an indie musician's approach to music, the classical music.
Yeah. Well, I think when you experience a crash on that, like an economic crash for your tiny little nation on that scale, you realize you have to rely on yourself. And I think this crisis and this crash really pushed me into a very indie direction. And when I was 24, 25, I started my own record label, called it Hands On Music. Released 2 or 3 or 4 albums on that, 3 albums actually. Started my own festival called Reykjavik Midsummer Music, and I, had very big ideas about it, and I had it for 7 or 8 years, starting in 2012. I always came out basically in deficit, but we created some incredible musical moments, and word started to spread a little bit outside of Iceland through that. And we did something else. We did a TV series and radio broadcasts on music, becoming a little bit more of, a communicator in that sense, and just sort of seeing where we could get with that. And we actually managed to get like a primetime slot in Icelandic, TV1 station on Sunday nights, where I would just have sort of freedom to talk about whatever I wanted with classical music. We actually had one show on folk music. I spoke about Bach, I spoke about Mozart, spoke about Ligeti and modern stuff, all sorts of things. So from that foundation of doing so many different things, in a way, creative in different ways, it all contributed to I think helping me find my voice more.
Help me out with this. Like when I was a kid, the classical music section of my local record store was kind of over in the corner, and the people who like classical music would go over there. But my understanding is from people who are talking to people in the record industry is that sales were okay generally for classical music records, but that they weren't amazing. Not everyone was listening to classical music. And then when I look at your streaming numbers, and not just your streaming numbers, but the streaming numbers of Gould for that matter.
Yeah.
We're talking 20 million, 30 million, 40 million streams. What's going on? What changed?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the old record stores with those glass cages where you had the classical music zoo inside, right? Like all those funny animals listening to opera.
Yeah,
and
people
the
with sweaters were going in. And right.
Yeah. Part of me misses that, and part of me certainly does not, because I've always been a guy who also listens to all sorts of. I just listen to music, whether it's classical or pop or rock or jazz, whatever. I just think, is it good music or is it bad music or folk or whatever? I mean, and I think the streaming platforms have had a hugely positive influence in that way, and we must remember to be a little bit grateful for that. Yeah, so the numbers are kind of staggering. Well, the thing is that there's no cage anymore. There's no glass room anymore, and somehow if you choose to listen to me playing the Goldberg Variations, on Apple Music or Spotify, whatever you use, it might then take you in a completely different, direction, and you might just go into Bill Evans after that or whatever, who knows? But somehow the boundaries have evaporated, and I think it's a great thing. And I think people just forget that we're having a golden age for classical music. I just celebrated my 1 billionth stream, and I'm one person in this, ecosystem of music, and Gould certainly has some unbelievable amount of streams. I take it all together, and then you think of the Goldberg Variations by Johann Sebastian Bach, which was basically written for a guy who wanted to fall asleep and couldn't. And Mr. Goldberg, who was his 14-year-old, student who had to play for the count who wanted to fall asleep. So these are like two people, and one of them wants to fall asleep, and that's the audience. In these days, if you actually told like Bach that like the Goldberg Variations alone is one of like more than 1,000 works he wrote, this one piece, I don't even know. I mean, this must have streams in the billions, just this one piece, and then take everything else and think about the relevance of what we're doing and of classical music in people's lives. I love like the end of year list that I see when Spotify is like, who are your most streamed artists for 2024? And you see those lists. Sometimes your fans post this and tag you, and some of it you see and some of it you don't. But I saw some incredible lists, like for myself, where I was like there in the top 5 spots with Bach or something. And then you would see like some interesting like music from Indianapolis, like some folk music even, and you would go
hip hop or
or like sort of progressive techno and all sorts of things, and you would have Billie Holiday, and you would have everything was coexisting, so beautifully in those weird lists. And I just thought, oh, this is it. This is the golden age.
Do you have a favorite variation?
Some of the variations are so busy, and so just so fantastic, but so busy. And then you have this variation number 13, which is close to the middle of the piece, and it just feels like Bach is taking a day off. He's daydreaming, and he's sort of hovering always around the beat in the right hand, so. That is something I always love. It always comes like a sense of relief in that mega structure. It's so effortless, and it's so serene. It's just sunshine,
I can't thank you enough for coming in and talking to us a little bit about Gould, and reluctantly talking a little bit about yourself too. And I really want to thank you so much for making that piano that Glenn Gould himself practiced on, that he rehearsed on. It was his favorite practice piano, making it sing again. So thank you so much for coming in.
It's my honor to play this piano, and great to meet you.